Hello and welcome to yet another video about Spec Builder capabilities. Today we're going to talk about how you can transform the data or create the transformation maps using Spec Builder. In Spec Builder, as we mentioned in the very beginning, there is an ability to build the new map. Map is a definition of how you want to transform the data from one standard, from one format to another. You can transform pretty much from any standard to any. So you can pick the EDI and convert that to positional file, or take XML, convert to positional or to EDI, or do any other transformation that you need. When I say transformation, you first would define the schema for this transformation. We call this schema a map. And then you can actually test the data transformation. So let's get started. As a sample, let's take our previous use case when our partner, Great Supplies Inc., sent us some information about their database format. And let's assume we use the database to store the purchase orders. So when purchase orders come in from our partner in EDI format, we need to transform that to some positional format, which is understood by our database loading application. So our source file would be 850 purchase order. We'll click next. And by the way, you can either create the file from the database or you can pick it from the file. And that third option we'll cover in a few minutes. That stands for the use case when you need to enrich the data, when you map the data to itself, basically. So as a target, we will take the purchase order database structure, which we created in the previous video from the data file using the spec generator. So let's click next. And we get the map editor. So let's spend a couple minutes explaining what do you see on the screen and how to use that. As you can tell on the left side of the screen, you have the structure of your purchase order, 850 transaction. There are all segments, all elements, pretty much the same view you have seen previously when we edited the guideline, when we added user nodes and so forth. On the right side, you see the target structure, which is our database structure. You should remember that from the previous video, where we have the header section, we have the detail section, which is basically the line item from the purchase order. The whole process of building maps is as simple as building the straight links from the source to the target, and we'll get to that. At the top in the ribbon you see all the major operations that are available. For now we won't spend time explaining all of those, but we'll get to pretty much all of these buttons during this video. The bottom panel has multiple tabs. It represents various aspects which you use while building the map. The most important is the data translation. This is where we would actually submit the data, execute the data, and see the result. We would see the result of the translation process, the target map, target data, which is the positional flat file. There are also errors, some user nodes from the guideline which you might have set for your schema, and some other tabs. We'll use those again during this demo. So let's dive in and build a very simple map. On the left side, if you notice, your transaction starts from the ST segment. The reason for that is because this part of the data file, which obviously starts with the ISA, then JS, and only then ST, only that part carries the payload, and the envelopes may change. So envelopes mostly define the information about the data movement, who sent the data, when the data was sent, and so on. So that part is separate from the transaction. However, we can use that information to build a map, because in our example on the right side we have the fields. We have fields for sender, receiver, purchase order date, and so on. So we will need to fill those. In order to access the information from envelopes, we will need to right-click on the root node X12 guideline, go to internal properties. This is how the envelope information is called, and then we can populate predefined. As you can see, our map is immediately enhanced with the structure of the envelope segments: interchange, group, and transaction ID. So let's pick interchange sender ID and just drag and drop that to the sender. Then receiver, and we drop it at the receiver. So it's as simple as that, and we can actually collapse that because we don't need that, but you still see that the links are coming to that node. So if you need those, you can double click and it'll expand the place where this link is going to. So let's collapse that, and we would take the date field from the BEG segment and we would link that to PO date. So our header section mapping is pretty much done. So as you see, we just spent like a minute to build that map. Now let's take a look at this section. This section holds different tabs. Tabs usually separate the different logical unit of mapping. If we double click on that, we'll get a tab name. Let's give it a name header. We can very well create the new tabs. We right click, click new, and we get the new tab. So let's call this tab detail. This will be the placeholder for our mapping of the detail part. Since the detail part stands for the line item, which is PO1 loop, we'll go to that PO1 loop. Now remember, the PO1 loop repeats, so there are multiple instances of the PO1 loop in the data. However, the beauty of MapBuilder, of this map editor, is you do not need to worry about those repetitions. The system will take care about that automatically. So let me explain how that works. So we'll take the assigned identification, the quantity, the units. Oh, sorry, this is the unit price, and the unit measurement code. And then we will go to the DTM segment and we would map the delivery date. I leave that field for now. We'll talk about that very shortly. All right, so we've done our header mapping, we've done our detail mapping. Now it's a good time to try that against the real data. So I go to that tab, I click new data, then I pick the source data. So now let's take this one. We'll execute that data. And now we got our translation. On the source side here, we see all the data structure, very similar to the data analyzer tab that we've seen previously with the data structure. There are all the PO1 segments and all that. On the right side, we see the actual result of the mapping. This is the header. It has all the information, the first detail record, and so on. So if we expand that, we can see that there is some name, quantity, units, and so on. So we've accomplished a very simple part, the mapping. However, as you can see, just within a couple minutes, we were able to define the structure of mapping. So if somebody needs to take that and use somewhere, this is a very good way to document the mapping because it's very visual, it is searchable, you work with the same structures you built in SpecBuilder previously, so you can reuse the work which you have already done to do the mapping. Even if you're just documenting that and doing some ad hoc testing, this is very powerful because you do not need to write any code, do any XML configurations, nothing like that. It's all UI, it's all visual and interactive. However, you probably could ask that it's not always just straight maps. In many cases, you need to do certain transformations. You need to change the way data is presented in the source or in the target. So let's pick this example, the date. Let's imagine that in our requirements, the date must be in US standard date format, which is month/day/year. And now we see, and here we see that it's year, then month, and then day. So now we can use the built-in functions. So let's take a little break and I'll explain what are the functions. The functions are pre-built modules which can execute certain functionality. There are different categories of functions. As you can see, it's copy, core, datetime, string, programming, and so on. So each category holds various functions for various purposes. There are some math, you can add some scripting, we'll talk about that in a few minutes, and you can do a lot of things with strings. So in our case, we are about to do some datetime conversion. So let's pick this function. Every function is represented as this little box with the title, inbound and outbound. If you double click, that will open the function properties. You can go to settings. Now we can pick our source format. Our source format is this. And in the target format, you could either pick one of these ones, or you can just type whatever you need. So let's type it DD YYYY. And okay. Now, instead of just doing the straight connection, we would connect that to the source of this function, and the result of this function would go to the delivery date. Now let's remap. This button stands for the retranslate, so we'll just hit that button and the process will repeat. As you can see, the dates have changed to the proper format which we needed. And by the way, all the capabilities which you've seen in SpecBuilder previously, like printing the data, you can see you can print out that data file which you obtained during the execution. You can send it to somebody to verify if that's the expectation, like you can send it to your database developer to see if this is the type of file you would need, or you can just save this file and it'll just generate the positional flat file, same database file, and we can go to Data Explorer and open the database file. We can just skip that. So it has all the information needed. It is very simple, straightforward, and can be used in your database. However, in some cases, not very often, because in many cases, or in the majority of cases, the functions would cover everything you need from the transformation standpoint. But still, sometimes you would need to do something more than just simple operations or a group of simple operations. And by the way, the functions may be chained, meaning you can connect one function to another. If you have certain math operations, then you can have add function, connect the add function to multiply function, and build a chain of functions. That's pretty usual. But in some cases, you would need something more complex. In this case, you can actually script your logic either using .NET or JavaScript or Java. And same as with guideline edits, you can, if you use Java or JavaScript, whatever language you choose, you can pick any functional capabilities of that language. So you can connect to databases, to web service calls, or anything which is allowed in the language. So let's take a look at JavaScript. So what we're going to do is we need to calculate what percentage from the total amount forms the amount of a particular line item. So the total amount of the line item is stored in this empty segment. So we would need this empty segment, and we would also need the total amount. So let's go up here. There is an empty loop and the empty which holds the total amount for the entire purchase order. So we'll take that value as well. As you can see now, we work with two values, and those two values reside in completely different parts of the map. That part is in the header section, and then this part would repeat, and for every line item will have a different value. Now let's double click on this function and take a look at the settings. Here we see 2 inputs and 1 output. And in the inputs you would notice this checkbox called reset. Reset means whether you need to reset the value of this input with every new execution of the function. So in our case, the value 2, which goes to the global purchase order amount, we do not need that to be reset. So we'll remove the checkbox and let's go to settings. Now we need to write the JavaScript which will do this calculation of this percentage from total amount. Same as with JavaScript or edits on the, we can use the built-in Edifecs objects to access the inputs, the outputs of the function, and some other parameters. So we can open up help, and same as previously, you can go to advanced features of mapping and you can see all the objects. In this case we need EC data helper, which has the function to extract the input value. So let's write our script. First we need to get the total amount, so let's call it total amount equals to EC data helper, and the method is called get value by index, and the index would be 0. It's all 0 based. Then we'll get the current amount, and it would be equal to index 1. Alright, now we need to produce the result. Producing the result means we need to output the result into so-called EC result helper. This is another Edifecs object which generates the responses, and there is a method called report result by index. We'll take 0 index, and now we need to calculate this percentage. So we'll start with current amount divided by total amount multiplied by 100, and its percentage. Now we need to use this parse float in order to convert the default string value to the float value. Parse float. Okay, so we can close that out, and now we can connect this output to the percentage. Let's execute the map and we'll see what happens. No errors detected. We'll close that. Now, as you can see, there is a percentage, but it has this decimal part which we do not need. So let's go back to the script, and we can use JavaScript capability of math round. So we'll just round the value, and we can test how it works by retranslating. Let's do that. And now we have this. So let's take a look at the detail record, and here is the percentage. So it's 12%, 11, 8, and so forth. So this shows you how you can use the more advanced programming capabilities of doing this translation. Now let's take a look at another piece of data. So let me load another data file, and let's see what happens. If we switch to data errors, we should see that there is some exception which tells that the date is unparsable and the value is D something. So let's go back to data file and see what is this. And if we look here, we would see that the date field has some D in front, which is probably not correct. But we don't really know what caused that. Well, we can of course suspect that this is this function, but if the map is pretty complex, you probably would not know which exact place causes the problem. So what happens is you may have multiple functions doing some execution, and it's very difficult to understand at which point this exception might happen. So what you can do is, and you know that this is caused by this data. So what you can do is you can use built-in debugging capabilities. So in order to verify that the logic of your map is correct, you can do step-by-step debugging as you would do in any other developer IDE. So let's put the breakpoint. We shall now use this debug section. So we put breakpoint on this date, which means as soon as we reach the point, this point where the date comes out, the execution would stop. So let's start the debugger. It will show you, and now this yellow balloon shows that the execution reached this point. Now let's examine the bottom part. As you can see, we have map trace history, which shows all the previous events which led to this breakpoint. So we've got the original file, then the PO1 loop, then DTM segment, and finally this is the element with this incorrect value. So let's step over, and we see the exception. So as we can see, the exception is on this function convert date time, and the exception says unparsable date, which is correct because we have, if you remember, we have this YYY MMDD. So this D doesn't work well in this pattern. So now we can either just ignore this and continue executing, or we can click no, which we would do, and let's examine what we have here. First, if you hover the mouse over any function, then you would see the inputs and outputs of this function. So that helps analyzing what goes wrong with the data or something else. So in this case, we see that the input is D and then 2014. And other tabs which might be useful are locals. It shows all the information about the current context. It shows the source of this data, it shows the inputs and outputs of the function, and should you have more function or more inputs, you would see them in here. You can also check all the functions. This is just the way to navigate between them very quickly. So by having that, you can debug, troubleshoot, so you can put as many breakpoints as needed, and all breakpoints are shown here. You can remove them, you can toggle them, do anything like that. Once you're done troubleshooting, you don't need to continue executing the map. You found the error, you can just click stop, the execution would stop. You can go to data translation, or you can open the data file in your data editor, and then you can correct the error and resubmit. So this is how you would troubleshoot anything wrong with the data. When you execute the data, you hit the problem, you can verify why the problem happened. Now, when you're done working with the map, you build all the functions, you built the logic, you tested the logic, it all works well, you executed that against the data, everything is good, you're done. What you want to do is, you may want to publish that information. You want to create the consumable document which you can send to your trading partners, even those who don't have SpecBuilder yet, or you may convince them to have SpecBuilder. So to do that, you can go to File, Publish, and you can choose the Excel publication. So let's click on that. So let's give it some name. Publish 1. We'll click Next. I have some settings in here, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So those settings allow you to define various aspects of the publication. You can publish from source to target or from target to source. You can limit, in this case I limited the publication to only the linked items. So click next, skip that. You can define columns. I'll show you the columns when we get to the file. So this is the columns for the source, the columns for the target. There is a special macro language which you can use, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. We'll click next, and we'll open the exported document. So now we open the document. This is how the document would look like. Now let's take a closer look at this. There are multiple columns. There is a source side and there is a target side. Source side is the EDI file which we had, and there are multiple columns. Those columns are customizable, and the content of those columns. For now, I chose what is called EDI path, which shows the path to the element from the very top, 850, loop AMT, AMT segment, and AMT02 element. But you could format this pretty heavily. You can do anything. You can use the IDs of the node, names, user nodes, whatever is needed to make it more convenient for you. So I chose that. On the right side, we have the section where this data goes to, like header or detail, and the exact field which is being mapped. So we have this map. In the middle section, we have either direct copy, which means just a straight link, or something more complex like the JavaScript. It shows where the inbound data came from, and this is the clickable. You can navigate to that place. The output goes to this detail. You can see some settings. If we expand that, then we shall see all the JavaScript code, and that is also applicable for other functions as well, like the date type, and so on. So you can do just that. So this is the way for you to publish the map document in order to communicate that to somebody else. So you can send this actual print out. This is in an Excel format, and you can use that anywhere you need. Now let's go back and let's do one more modification to the data. So let me run the data again. This time I'll pick simple data. As you can see, we have these units, which is mapped straight from the units or basis or for measurement code from X12, which is 01, and it's not very convenient if you don't know all the EDI code sets. So what we can do is we can transform that to the actual representation of the unit. So for that, we can use the function which is called conversional copy. So let's open settings. It's very simple one-to-one map. So we can type in here 01, and this will be the actual pounds. And we can also use LT, which stands for liters. And now, instead of just doing this straight copy, we can reposition that to the conversional copy and then do this. Now let's remap and see what happens. Now, as you can see, we have actual pounds, liters. So instead of having those not very convenient codes, we can have the actual values. So this is how you can enhance your data by doing one more step forward towards the better representation of the data, of course, if you need to do so. Now let's take a look at one data file. So let me open up the data file. So in this data file, every AMT segment may not be very well in the PO1 segment, may be not very well aligned to the total amount and the unit price. So like in this example, it's 120, which is obviously way more than 7 multiplied by 3. So what we may need to do is we may need to enhance the data, or in this case fix the data in some automated manner. And again, Spec Builder translation can help us with that, and we can do so by using that same mapping capabilities. So what we need to do is we need to create a new map. We'll go create a new map. We'll pick the source, which is 850, but now we'll just choose this from existing source, meaning we pick the same source. Well, it may sound a bit confusing. Why would we do map from one format to itself? But you will see that it's really useful. So what we can do here is we can drag and drop the most root node, and it will ask us what we want to do. So we want to use so-called auto-link children implicitly. If we click that, we shall see that all the nodes, all the elements of the data are linked to the same elements on the target side. So all those blue lines are the mappings. So if we just take the file, that amount, and execute that, we'll just see that same file on the right side. No changes. AMT amount is incorrect, so nothing changed. Now let's try to fix that. So in order to do that, what we need to do is we need to go to the PO1 segment here on the source and use the math function multiply. So we can take the quantity, take the unit price, and put that to the monetary amount on the right side. Now let's execute this map and we'll see what happens. So it was 120.28 and now it is 20.3, which matches to the 7 by 2.9, and that is applicable for every line item. So if we take the quantity, multiply that by unit price, we would get the proper amount. So by doing this very simple and very fast routine, we can really fix the data. We can enhance the data if needed. If there is need to do some additional programming or additional function or logic, we can plug it in here. And again, this may be a good way to document your map or to enhance the data very quickly, to do some ad hoc testing or to send that data back to your training partner. Now what you can do, you can put the user nodes, same user nodes as we had with a guideline. So we can type here something like this is a fix to the amount of the line item, and we can store that, and whoever works with this data or publishes the map, they would see this user node and that will give them information on what is this function about. So this concludes our session about mapping. That was just a high-level session. There are much more capabilities. You can, as I mentioned, write the code, Java, JavaScript, but hopefully that will give you the overview of what you can do with the map documents, and it's really a lot that you can do with those. So thank you, and we'll see you next time.